Today we are studying Matthew chapter 12, 9 through 13. Verse 9. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. Now, synagogues are not mentioned in the Old Testament. So if you're familiar with the Old Testament and then all of a sudden you go into the New Testament, you're like, where did all this synagogues come from? Because I never read about them in the Old Testament. So the synagogues come after the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then after they were freed, they constructed these synagogues as a place to where they can meet and teach and worship God. So Matthew moves his episode from the grain field to a local synagogue, their synagogue. Not the place where God, chose to reveal himself, but where they chose to do their religious rituals and make their rules and regulations. Verse 10, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Shriveled in Greek is xerox, means dry, wasted. It describes a condition in which the muscles and often the bones are like shrunken. The bones would shrink because of the fact that there was no movement in the hand. When paralysis inflicted a hand or leg, that part of the body basically would just shrivel up. For the muscles diminish, obviously, in size because of their lack of use. It's the loss of natural fluids, from living objects. The word heal, therapeo, properly means to heal or reversing a physical condition to restore a person having any type of illness. So this man wanted to be at church, or in this case, synagogue, to hear the word of God, no matter, what his condition was. And so it reminds me of the story of a young black man that sat at the back of the church until a white man came and told him, you are not welcome here. And so the young black man went out of the church and sat at the steps, when all of a sudden Jesus appeared to him and asked him, what is wrong? The man said, Lord, I tried to get into this church, but they won't let me. And Jesus said, don't be sad, son. I have been trying to get into that church for many years. So, in Luke's gospel, Luke tells us that it was his right hand. So throughout the scriptures, the right hand is a symbol of strength, might, or power. The right hand was used for greetings and to bestow blessings. The right hand was the clean hand, meaning a good Jew always ate with his right hand. The left hand was used for bodily functions. So apologies to all of you who are left-handed. The left hand was considered the unclean hand. Since this man's right hand was withered, he was handicapped, physically and psychologically. So here's a man who is incapacitated in the physical sphere. He cannot do any work. He is without strength. He is without might. He is without power. He is without authority. From that standpoint, he is utterly, completely, and totally disabled. What does this story tell us about the man with the withered hand? Not very much. Rather, it tells us that this is more about the Pharisees than the suffering man. So once again, this is all about the Sabbath question. The man with the withered hand was only an, incidental part of the equation. So there are 27 bones in the average hand, although some have a few extra. Every one of them is essential for its proper function. If there was one less bone in each finger, it would lose at least 50% of its, usefulness. So there are three major nerves serving the hand. The loss of any one would cause the hand useless. There are tendons which connect each finger, bone to the muscles, which, makes them move. So each finger bone has more than one muscle working for it in order to make it do what it does. And those muscles are not in the finger itself or the hand, but actually up in the arm. So I could go on, but these few things mean that in order for the hand to function, all the various parts must work as a team. Like some Christians today, the Pharisees had their pet doctrine, their favorite sin, their latest conspiracy, and that was the only thing that they could think about. We know nothing about him other than his condition. Did the man have a birth defect? Had he never been able to use his hand? Had an axe cut through one of the nerves which controlled the use of his hand? Had he fallen as a child and jammed his arm in such a way that there was, lack of blood flow, which caused, the death of his hand? But what about some of the other parts of this man? What was his attitude? Despite the fact that he was in the local synagogue, was he angry with the Lord for his condition? Or had the accident occurred so many years ago that he had become content and learned to cope with only one hand? Excuse me. So, the Sabbath. We're going to discuss a little bit about the Sabbath. Now, the Hebrew word for Sabbath means basically to cease, to stop. It is the verb yisbot. It is a consecutive imperfect. Cease working or to rest. The day which stops, basically in the original meaning. Now, this is not talking about the weekly Sabbath. Okay, this is talking about a different kind of Sabbath. And here you can see in the Greek, katepause, he rested on the seventh day. And down here in the Hebrew, on the left side with the yellow arrow, notice that it says yisbot, he rested on the seventh day down at the bottom. Okay, and so yisbot is the word that is used for what we think is Sabbath rest, so to speak. One can search the entire book of Genesis and read the first 15 chapters of Exodus, and you're not going to find a single reference to the Sabbath. These two books, Genesis and Exodus, they cover a period of over 2,500 years. And Seventh-day Adventists claim that the Sabbath has always been a universal law from the beginning. Some will say, but doesn't the Bible say that God rested on the seventh day of creation? Yes, but there's no command from God to keep it. It only says that he rested on that day. In fact, there's no mention of the Sabbath from Adam and Eve, or Abel, or Noah, Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. For 2,500 years, there's no mention from Adam to Moses. Not one patriarch observed the Sabbath. So when was the Sabbath mentioned? Well, it wasn't until Israel had been delivered from the Egyptian bondage, shortly before the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Now, the first reference is made to the Sabbath, as you can see here in Exodus chapter 16, verse 23 through 30. Notice there on the top right, a Sabbath or Sabbata, rest, anapausis, holy, agia, to the Lord. Notice that it says, is tomorrow. So in other words, if the Sabbath was already a universal law, wouldn't they know it already? Why does God have to tell them, hey, it's tomorrow? And it's not just a Sabbath rest, it is a agia, holy Sabbath. Okay? And so that makes a distinction here. So that's in the Greek, because the Greek is older than the Hebrew. Now notice the Hebrew at the bottom. Obviously you read from, right to left. But notice that it says Sabbaton, Sabbath rest. It's a noun, masculine, singular. Yisbot, the one we saw earlier, is a verb. Notice here, towards the left of the screen, it says Kodesh. That means holy. A holy Sabbath. and it's still a noun. The one we saw earlier for the word Sabbath or Sabbath rest is yizbot, and yizbot is not a noun, it's a verb. So it's not the same word that's being used. The first time we're actually getting a reference about the Sabbath is here, Exodus 16:23. It was not in Genesis. Now here, Exodus 20, the verses are 8 through 11, but we're focusing on 8 right now. In the Greek, remember the day of the Sabbath, Sabbaton, to sanctify it. See, God is saying, remember it. 6 days you shall do all your works, but the seventh, there it is a Sabbath to the Lord. So if the Sabbath was already being practiced, wouldn't they know this already? God is telling them to remember it, to sanctify it. And he's telling them, you have to work 6 days. And on the seventh, it is a Sabbaton, it is a Sabbath. Now here in the Hebrew, in the middle, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day, ha-sabbat, keep it holy, kadosh. Okay. Here at the bottom, again, the seventh day. That's verse 10. So if God is reminding them that it's on the seventh day, then it's something that they never heard about. See? So why would they say that this goes all the way back to Genesis, that's when you're supposed to keep the Sabbath? Now, to whom was the Sabbath given to? To Israel, no other nation. That's Exodus 31, 12 through 17. And so those that claim that the Sabbath was universal from Genesis have not read Nehemiah. Notice what Nehemiah says. Moreover, you led them by day with a cloudy pillar. Verse 13. You came down also on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven and gave them just ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments. Verse 14. You made known to them your holy Sabbath. It can't be any clearer. He says, you've made known to them your holy Sabbath. If they already knew about the Sabbath from Genesis, why does Nehemiah say, you made them known your holy Sabbath? So, if one desires the Sabbath, well, then one would have to become an Israelite and be under the law. The Sabbath law says one must remain indoors on that day. And it's a day of absolute rest. It's not a day of worship, nor religious activities or public meetings, but only to remain indoors and rest. In fact, Exodus 31:14 mentions death as the penalty for violating the Sabbath. Israel has had many, tragedies because of their failure to keep the Sabbath law. So observing the Sabbath was not just the weekly Sabbath, for there was also a sabbatical year. So every 7 years the ground was to lie fallow, slaves were set free, no crops were planted. And every 50th year was a jubilee, or Yobel, or the ram's horn. On Jubilee, 4 things were to happen. Slaves were to be set free, the land was to rest, debts were forgiven, and the land reverted to the original owner. Property was worth more 30 years before the Jubilee than 6 months before the Jubilee. In other words, who's going to pay a lot of money for something he will own for a few months? The Sabbath would become the central feature of Israel's social and economic life. No nation in the world followed a system like this. There were many benefits of following the sabbatical law: eliminating poverty in Israel, abolishing social class, no slavery, and raising the standard of living for everyone. But it required a step of faith, because it was not logical for the natural mind to tell a farmer today he would do better in the long run planting crops 6 out of 7 years. His response would be that he cannot afford to let the land rest for a year. So companies, pump the land with chemicals to keep it from becoming, as they say, depleted. There's no record of Israel keeping the sabbatical year or the year of Jubilee. They were experts in the weekly Sabbath. In fact, they became a science to them. The Israelites thought that, they couldn't afford to obey God, but it always costs more to disobey God than to obey God. For example, when the children of Israel sent the spies into Canaan, the Lord told them, take the land, but they decided they knew better. So for every day that the spies spent in the land of Canaan, the children of Israel spent 1 year wandering in the wilderness. 40 days of seeing the beauty and the bounty of the land turned into 40 years of wandering through the desert. 40 days for 40 years. That's the formula for accountability. 1 day of illumination multiplied by disobedience equals 1 year of judgment. So Israel was driven from her land, what we call the diaspora. Israel was exiled into the nations by God. And this was already prophesied in Leviticus 26:32 through 35. I will lay waste the land so that your enemies who live there will be appalled. Verse 33, I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste and your cities will lie in ruins. Verse 34, as you can see here. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years all the time that it lies desolate and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbath. Verse 35, all the time that it lies desolate, the land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths that you lived in it. So we can honestly say that the Jews were sent into captivity to Babylon because they didn't let the land rest for 1 year. So Israel was in the land for 490 years before the Babylonian captivity. And when God judged the Babylonians, Israel ended up how many years in captivity? 70. Why 70? Because that is what they owed. Remember that they had to let the land rest for 1 year out of every 7. And if you divide 490 years by 7, the answer is 70. So 70 years of captivity. Now, it's true that the Babylonians also had a Sabbath, but this was a Sabbath unique to Israel only. Okay, so the Babylonians also celebrated their Sabbath, their version. The uniqueness is that this is a covenant with Israel. And so the historian Socrates wrote in the middle of the 5th century, almost all churches throughout the world celebrated the sacred mysteries of the Sabbath of every week. Yet the Christians of Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient traditions, refused to do this. Emperor Constantine in the 3rd century was the one who began divorcing the church from its, you can kind of say, its Jewish roots and claiming that the church replaced Israel, so to speak, and that the Jewish holidays were replaced with the Christian holidays. They say, we don't want to worship on the Jewish Sabbath, so we will worship on Sunday. And that's how it got changed, according to tradition. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church here on the right side says the Roman Catholic Church changed the observance of the Sabbath to Sunday by right of the divine, infallible authority given to her by her founder, Jesus Christ. The Protestant, claiming the Bible to be the only guide of faith, has no warrant for observing Sunday. In this matter, the Seventh-day Adventist is the only consistent Protestant. And so, obviously, the Catholic Church doesn't come into full power till about the 5th century. And so, because they have this power, it's like they're basically defining that we are the ones who changed it. Okay, but it goes all the way back through Constantine, right? And so now the Pharisees did not always agree how the Sabbath should be observed. So there were two basic schools of thought that existed before Jesus' time, but they were being practiced during Jesus' time. Now, one thought was led by a rabbi named Hillel. Now, Hillel represented the liberal city dwellers. He is known for the phrase, If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And he's also known for the golden rule. Now, the other rabbi was Shammai, who represented basically the conservative view, strict interpreter of the law. You know, uh, they feared the Jews' contact with the Romans and would, weaken the Jewish community. So you had to be strict with these rules. So Hillel's view were written down on what is known as the Mishnah, or the repetition. And here I have a portion of it, and you can see there in the red. Now, conflict over the Sabbath between Jesus and the Pharisees involved healing. So the Mishnah lays down the principle that a case of risk of loss of life or any illness that endangers the risk of loss of life supersedes the Sabbath law. And that is the Mishnah law, Yoma 8:6. And so Yoma just means from that day, okay, from that day that it was created. And so at the bottom, you can see what I just read concerning a life-threatening situation overrides the Sabbath. Okay, so traditional Christian interpretation is that the Pharisees were angry that Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. But that is not the case from a Jewish perspective. Pharisees did not oppose healing that could have waited until after the Sabbath. So, for example, John 5:1-18, the Pharisees did not question Jesus' healing on the Sabbath, but that in this incident, they criticized Jesus for telling the man to pick up his mat and carry it. So Jesus was usually asked by the Pharisees, "What do you say?" Well, what do they mean by that? They come to Jesus, "No, but what do you say?" In other words, Jesus, which of the two great rabbis do you agree with, Hillel or Shammai? That's what's being implied by saying, "What do you say?" To see which side Jesus takes, Hillel's side or Shammai's side. And so, verse 11, he said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out?" Now, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they discovered a lot of, biblical and non-biblical writings, there's one that we call the Damascus document. And so the Qumran, that's the area where they live, called Qumran, they were stricter on these issues. And here's one from the Damascus document I have here. No one should help an animal give birth on the Sabbath day. And if he makes it fall into a well or a pit, he should not take it out on the Sabbath. So see, they're more stricter. And then in that same document, it even says in verses 16-17, if a living man fell into water, they were not to take him out by using a ladder, rope, or a utensil. And so that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, verse 12. So the Dead Sea Scrolls is about, somewhere between 200 BC all the way to, even the first century. We can say even after the Romans destroyed, Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, our time. And so a lot of these Jews were living in the desert, and they were hiding in caves or working in caves, and they left all these documents there in the caves, which were discovered in 1947, 48, 49, 50, all the way to probably 1954, 55. And so we have these writings from them that gives us their way of life, what they wrote, what they believed. So this is before Jesus. Verse 12, how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So note the emphasis here on humanity, not divinity. Notice he doesn't say, is it lawful to heal? He broadens it. Not only to heal, but any other good act is included. So the answer, it is lawful to do good. Lawful doesn't mean required. And so it's this Greek word here, how much then differs a man than a sheep? so that it is allowed. Allowed here is existing, permitted. And so God gave humans authority, remember, dominion over the animals to care for them just as God cares for us. So what happens when humanity falls in a pit? Well, it's God's responsibility. And he is working to rescue us and restore the rest to his realm, which he did with Jesus Christ. Now, the famous John MacArthur, he discusses the Hindus' attitude towards humans and animals. Their belief in reincarnation, causes them to not harm rodents and other pests. They won't kill a fly because it is the incarnation of someone who is trying to get out of that karma. They won't kill a rat or a mouse, which consumes 2/3 of their food supply. And for this reason, India is full of starving people who are at the bottom of the caste system. They let people die all over the place and don't help them because it's their karma. They won't give money to beggars or help the destitute because they feel they must endure that suffering to earn their way to the next level. So cows are worth more to them than people. Cows are sacred, for whatever their reasons are. And so this is just to give you a backdrop of, well, which is worth more, human being or the animal, the sheep. So it helps to remember, the historical context behind all this to understand what's happening here. The Jews were developing specific regulations to cover any and every possible circumstance to keep them from sinning. So by Jesus' time, they had already turned their observance of the law into a legalistic ritual rather than a loving service to God and man. They did this sincerely in a vain effort to become holy, not understanding that this is not how a man becomes spiritually holy. The big question is, did Jesus do away with the Sabbath or restore it to its original divine value and function, as he did with marriage and divorce and in Matthew 19:8? So the Pharisees claim that they are right with God in criticizing Jesus for healing on the Sabbath day, while they're plotting murder in their hearts to get rid of Jesus. So Jesus gave no indication that he intended doing away with the Sabbath. He merely broke their misguided perception of how to observe the Sabbath. Now, there were certain activities that were permitted on the Sabbath. And so one is mentioned by Jesus in Matthew 1:5, the sacrificial activities of the priests, which is really unique to Matthew. It concerns the service that the priests performed every Sabbath day. According to the law, the priests were to make certain sacrifices every Sabbath day, according to the book of Numbers 28, verse 9 and 10. Verse 13, then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. So the Lord Jesus turns to the man with the withered hand, and the man does not ask Jesus to be healed, nor did anyone else ask for him. Jesus did not even touch the man, so that even the strictest Pharisees could not have something to accuse Jesus of, as of working with your hand or touching, which you shouldn't be touching somebody who has a disease or an illness. And so all Jesus did was simply give the word, stretch forth your hand. If the man was seated, he was told to stand. If he was standing, he was told to step forward. And then he was told to stretch out your hand. Luke's gospel tells us he stood up. So the disciples perhaps were thinking, Lord, don't you know that this will embarrass this man if he stands up in the midst of all these people? Lord, you know his condition. The others see his condition. Why would you have him stand up in the midst of these people in the house of God? When the man was willing to come to Jesus, it was then that Jesus became willing to heal this man. What the Lord commanded the man to do was to believe him and to obey. It was to believe him about something which he had never done before. Not only was it something he had never done, but something which he knew he was incapable of doing. When he was healed, others could possibly see other little problems in his life. But there's one thing for sure that they could not deny. They could not deny that Jesus did a great miracle in this man's life. So, what could be the application? Well, we rest on a person, not a day. Jesus is not the Sabbath, but the Lord of the Sabbath. And he said unto them, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Please subscribe, please share. Thank you, and God bless you.